The land office in Caldwell, Kansas smelled like dust and desperation, and Adelaide Townsend had walked into it knowing full well that both of those things were about to define her future. She stood at the long pine counter, her fingers pressing flat against the wood to stop them from trembling, and she did not look around. She could not afford to look around. Because looking around meant acknowledging the four men who had followed her 3 blocks from the hotel, who had stood outside the livery when she retrieved her documents that morning, who had made it abundantly clear, without a single word spoken, that they did not intend for her to reach this counter successfully. She had reached it anyway. That was what Adelaide Townsend did. She reached things anyway. The clerk behind the counter was a wiry man named Pembroke with spectacles that sat too low on his nose, and he was looking at her with the specific expression men in positions of minor authority reserved for women who showed up alone and expected to be taken seriously. It was a look that combined skepticism with something close to pity, and Adelaide had seen it so many times in the past 4 months that she had stopped feeling anything about it except a cold, practical resolve to dismantle it as efficiently as possible. "I am here to file the deed transfer on the Townsend parcel," she said, keeping her voice level. 420 acres, northeast quarter of Section 12, Township 33, Range 3 West. The original claim was filed by my father, Gerald Townsend, in the spring of 1879. He passed on February 14th of this year, and I am his sole heir. I have the death certificate, the original land patent, and the notarized letter of inheritance executed in Wichita 3 weeks ago. She placed each document on the counter with precise, deliberate movements, arranging them in the order she had rehearsed, because she had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it standing in front of a cracked mirror in a $2 hotel room, speaking the words to her own reflection until they came out without a single waver. Pembroke picked up the death certificate and looked at it the way men looked at things they were hoping to find fault with. That was when she felt it. The presence. Not threatening, not hovering, simply there, as solid and unhurried as a fence post, directly beside her left shoulder. She turned her head slowly because turning quickly would have looked like fear, and she was not going to look afraid. Not here, not now. He was tall. Not the theatrical, gunslinging kind of tall she had encountered in dime novels, but the kind of tall that came from a body built for practical use, for long hours in saddle and sun. He wore a plain dark coat over a gray shirt, and the tin star pinned to his chest caught the pale morning light filtering through the land office window. His hat was pulled low, but not so low that she couldn't see his eyes, which were a clear, steady gray, and which were not looking at the clerk. They were looking at her with an expression that was not pity, was not skepticism, and was not the particular calculating interest of the men who had followed her here. It was something more careful than any of those things. It was attention. "Marshal Elijah Rourke," he said, and he said it quietly as though he were not making an announcement but simply offering information she might find useful. "Caldwell office. I couldn't help but notice you were accompanied to town this morning, Miss Townsend," she said. "Adelaide Townsend, and I was not accompanied, I was followed. There is a significant difference." Something shifted very slightly in those gray eyes. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "There is," he agreed. "The 4 men outside, I know them. Then you know they have no legal claim to my father's land." "I know they believe they do," he said, "which is a more dangerous thing in my experience than actually having one." Pembroke cleared his throat. "Miss Townsend, there is in fact a competing claim filed on this property, filed 6 weeks ago by a Mr. Cornelius Hatch on behalf of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company." Adelaide felt the floor of her stomach drop clean away, but she did not show it. She had not come this far and survived the past 4 months to show it now. "That claim," she said, "is fraudulent." "That's a serious allegation," Pembroke said. "It is a serious situation," Adelaide replied, and she reached into her satchel for one more document. "Which is why I also brought this." She placed it on the counter. It was a letter signed and sealed from Judge Harlan Cross of the Sedgwick County District Court, acknowledging receipt of her inheritance documentation, and noting that any competing claims filed on the Townsend parcel within the past 90 days would be subject to judicial review before any land office transfer could be processed. Pembroke took it, read it twice, looked at Marshal Rourke. Marshal Rourke said nothing. He simply waited. Adelaide Townsend had arrived in Caldwell 3 days ago, and in those 3 days, she had learned that the town existed in a delicate, exhausting balance between the law as written and the law as practiced by men with enough money to blur the difference. She had learned this because her father had learned it first, and had written to her about it in the careful, close-lettered script of a man who had spent most of his adult life trying to protect something he had built with his own hands from people who wanted to take it because they could. Gerald Townsend had come west in 1872, when Adelaide was 11 years old and still in Ohio with her mother's sister, who had agreed to raise her after her mother died of pneumonia the previous winter. He had not taken Adelaide with him because he was a practical man, and the frontier was not, at that point, a practical place for a child who had just lost her mother. He had written to her every month for 7 years. He had sent money when he had it. He had built the claim piece by piece, year by year, until he had 420 acres of Kansas grassland that was his, legally and completely, with a deed to prove it. And then Cornelius Hatch and the Meridian Land and Cattle Company had decided they wanted it. Adelaide had been living in Cincinnati, working as a school teacher, and corresponding with her father about the possibility of eventually coming west to help him manage the place, when she received the telegram informing her that Gerald Townsend had died. The telegram came from a lawyer in Wichita named Aldous Prewitt, who had been her father's man of business, and it was followed 3 days later by a letter from Prewitt explaining that her father had died of a heart attack but that there were, as Prewitt put it, complicating factors surrounding the land. She had arrived in Wichita 6 weeks after her father's death. She had spent 2 weeks with Prewitt getting the paperwork in order. She had spent another week listening to Prewitt gently suggest that perhaps the wisest course would be to accept the Meridian Company's offer, which was not entirely unfair, and she had spent that same week explaining to Prewitt, with increasing patience, that she was not going to sell land that her father had worked for 20 years to a company that had used fraudulent competing claims, bribed officials, and in at least 2 documented cases, arranged for accidents to befall neighboring property owners who refused to sell. She had left Wichita for Caldwell with her documents and her resolve and no company except the steady certainty that she was right, which had felt, at times during the 3 days of travel, like a very small and insufficient companion. The men following her had appeared the morning of her second day on the road. 4 of them, keeping a careful distance, never close enough to constitute an obvious threat, but never far enough to constitute innocent travelers going the same direction. She had noted them and said nothing, and continued to Caldwell. Now she stood in the land office while Marshal Elijah Rourke read the letter from Judge Cross with the same careful attention he had given everything so far, and Pembroke shifted uncomfortably behind his counter, and outside the window the 4 men from the road were presumably still waiting, and Adelaide breathed steadily and waited for the next thing to happen. "The judge's letter takes precedence," Rourke said, setting it down. "Pembroke, you can't process any competing transfer on this parcel until the court has reviewed the inheritance claim. You know that, Mr. Hatch's people have been quite clear about their expectations," Pembroke said, and he said it in the tone of a man who had not slept well in several weeks. "I expect they have been," Rourke said, and the quiet in his voice had something underneath it now, something patient and completely immovable. "Record Miss Townsend's documents as received and pending judicial review, today, while I am standing here watching you do it." Pembroke did it. Adelaide walked out of the land office 12 minutes later with a receipt in her hand, her documents recorded, and the knowledge that she had won the first small battle in what was going to be a considerably larger war. She stepped onto the boardwalk and the Kansas sun hit her full in the face, and the four men were across the street, watching her with the kind of stillness that was meant to communicate something. Marshal Rourke stepped out behind her. He stood beside her on the boardwalk, not touching, not crowding, simply occupying the same space in a way that somehow managed to communicate everything that needed communicating to the four men across the street. "They won't do anything in town," he said, still quiet. "Not in daylight. Hatch has enough legal cover that he prefers to keep things looking proper." "For now," Adelaide said. "For now," he agreed. She turned to look at him properly for the first time since they'd been standing shoulder to shoulder at the counter. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 or 31, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and outdoor living but not yet worn by it. There was a quality to his stillness that she found herself wanting to examine the way you examined an unfamiliar piece of machinery, trying to understand how it worked. "Why did you come in?" she asked. "I didn't ask for help." "You didn't need to ask," he said. "I watched those four men follow you from the hotel. I watched you walk into that land office like you were walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, and you intended to change it. I thought you might appreciate having someone at your back who wasn't going to try to take something from you." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her in 4 months, and the directness of it did something unexpected to the careful composure she had been maintaining. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the simple words conveyed. He touched the brim of his hat. "Where are you staying?" "The Drovers Rest on 2nd Street." He nodded. "Lock your door tonight." "Not because I expect trouble, but because Hatch's people are predictable, and predictable is not the same as harmless." Then he turned and walked back down the boardwalk toward the marshal's office, and Adelaide watched him go and told herself very firmly that she did not have time to think about the color of a man's eyes or the particular quality of steadiness that some people carried in their bones. She had a land claim to protect. She had a father to honor. She did not have time for anything else. The Drovers Rest was a modest 2-story building that smelled of wood smoke and lye soap, and the ghosts of 10,000 trail hands who had passed through Caldwell over the years. Adelaide's room was on the 2nd floor, small and clean and containing a bed, a washstand, a single wooden chair, and a window that looked out over the main street. She had been sleeping, or rather not sleeping, in this room for 3 nights, and she had developed the habit of sitting in the chair by the window in the evenings and watching the street below while she went over her documents again by lamplight. That evening, she was doing exactly this when she saw Marshal Rourke cross the street below, moving with that same unhurried purposefulness she had noticed that morning. He didn't look up at her window. She wondered if he knew she was watching, and then she wondered why she was wondering that, and then she went back to her documents with a discipline that took more effort than she was entirely comfortable admitting. She had known other men in her life. She had been engaged briefly, at 22, to a schoolmaster in Cincinnati named Theodore Birch, who was kind and responsible and thoroughly good, and who had died of typhoid fever 6 weeks before their wedding. She had been 23 when she buried him and 29 now, and in the 6 years between those two facts, she had taught school and read books and written letters to her father, and maintained the careful, ordered life of a woman who had organized her heart the same way she organized her documents. Everything in its proper place, everything accounted for, nothing left to chance. Marshal Elijah Rourke was a variable she had not accounted for. She told herself this was irrelevant and went back to studying the fraudulent competing claim that Meridian had filed, looking for the flaw she knew had to be there. She found it at close to midnight. The competing claim referenced a survey conducted in November 1878, 8 months before her father had actually filed his original patent. The survey itself was dated correctly in the Meridian documents, but the legal description of the land used language from the government survey system that had not been standardized for this particular township until the spring of 1879. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that a careful person would notice, and a careless person would miss entirely, and Cornelius Hatch's lawyers had apparently been counting on the latter. Adelaide wrote it down, wrote it carefully, and allowed herself one moment of something that was very close to triumph before folding the papers and blowing out the lamp and lying down on the bed to sleep. She dreamed about gray eyes. In the morning, she went to the Marshal's office. It was a single room at the end of the main street, with a solid oak desk and a gun rack on one wall and a cot in the back corner that suggested Elijah Rourke sometimes slept in his office, which Adelaide found less surprising than she perhaps should have. He was at the desk when she came in, reading a telegraph message, and he looked up without apparent surprise, as though he had been expecting her. "I found it," she said, and put her notes on his desk. He looked at them for a long moment. "The survey language. You already knew. I suspected. I don't have the legal training to be certain." He looked up at her. "You do. My father sent me every document he had. I've been studying land patent law since the week after I received the telegram about his death." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, because she had learned by now that Elijah Rourke was the kind of man you could sit down in front of without having to perform standing at full height. This flaw is enough to invalidate the competing claim entirely. If it goes before Judge Cross's court, Meridian loses. "Hatch knows that too," Rourke said. He set the telegraph message down. "He received word yesterday that you had filed your documents. This morning I got a report from my deputy that 3 more men rode into town and went directly to Hatch's operation on the south side." Adelaide absorbed this. "He's escalating. He's preparing options," Rourke said, with the careful precision of a man who had dealt with Cornelius Hatch's kind before. "Legal options are one. Other options are another. Hatch prefers legal when it works, but he's not attached to it." "I need to get a message to Judge Cross's court," Adelaide said. "And I need it to arrive intact, which means I need someone I can trust to carry it. I'll send my deputy, James Wilder. He's young but he's honest, which is the specific combination that counts." Rourke paused. "There's something else you should know. Hatch approached 2 of the neighboring landowners this spring. One of them, a man named Vernon Cobb who owned the parcel directly east of your father's land, accepted the buyout. The other one, a widow named Martha Gale, refused. She had an accident with her wagon 3 weeks later, broke her arm and her collarbone. She sold the week after." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "My father wrote to me about Mrs. Gale. He was fond of her." She looked at her hands. "He wrote that she was strong." "She was," Rourke said, and the simplicity with which he said it told her something about what he thought of what had happened to Martha Gale. "How long have you been Marshal here?" she asked. 3 years. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "I came from Missouri. I was a deputy in St. Joseph before that." Something moved briefly across his face, something she didn't have enough information to read yet. "I took this posting because I was told Caldwell was a place that needed honest law." That was true. It was also true that certain people in this territory had decided honest law was less important than profitable law, and the 2 things have been in argument with each other ever since. Cornelius Hatch being one of those people. Cornelius Hatch being the primary one. He looked at her directly. "Miss Townsend, what I am about to tell you is not something I say to ease your mind. It is something I say because you have presented yourself as a person who operates better with complete information than with partial information, and I think I am correct about that." "You are," she said. "Hatch has connections in the territorial government in Topeka. One of the commissioners has been receiving payments from Meridian since 1877. My evidence of this is solid but not yet presentable in court, which means I cannot act on it directly. What it means in practical terms is that if this case goes in front of a court and Hatch loses, he will not accept it quietly. He will use those connections to create complications, and some of those complications may involve my position here." The weight of what he was telling her settled over her carefully. "You could lose your post." "I could," he said, with a calm that told her he had already made his peace with this possibility. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the person standing beside you in this has stakes of his own." There was something in this statement that Adelaide would return to later, in the quiet of her room, and examine from several different angles. The person standing beside you. He had said it as though it were already decided, as though the question of whose side he was on had been settled that morning in the land office and did not require further discussion. She said, "Then we had better make sure the case is airtight before it gets near a court." He almost smiled. "We," he said, "unless you have an objection." "None at all," Elijah Rourke said, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth was definitely the beginning of a smile. They worked for 4 days. Adelaide brought her documents to the Marshal's office each morning and spread them on the desk that Rourke cleared for her without being asked, and they went through every piece of paper connected to the Meridian competing claim and the original Townsend patent, building the case the way you built a fence, post by post, wire by wire, testing each connection for weakness. Rourke had his own files on Meridian's activities in Caldwell County, 3 years of careful record-keeping that cataloged patterns and incidents and documented observations in the precise, spare language of a man trained to notice and record without embellishment. Adelaide found that she liked this about him enormously. She liked that he did not exaggerate and did not minimize. She liked that when he was uncertain he said so, and when he was certain he gave his reasons, and that his reasons were always based on something she could evaluate rather than on the mere fact of his authority or his experience. She liked, too, though she admitted this only to herself and only in the honest moments before sleep, the way he brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, and the way he moved around the office when she was working in it, giving her space without creating distance, and the way, on the 3rd afternoon, when she had been staring at a document for 20 minutes in frustrated concentration, he had leaned over her shoulder and said quietly, "The secondary signature. Look at the notary seal." And he had been right. The seal was wrong. The registration number was from a county that had been reorganized 3 years before the document's purported date, and the brief shared triumph of that discovery had produced a warmth in Adelaide's chest that she was increasingly unable to categorize as merely professional. On the 4th evening, they stayed later than usual, both of them cross-referencing survey records with the Meridian claim documentation, and the lamp on the desk burned low, and outside the window the street grew quiet with the particular quiet of a frontier town settling into its night rhythms. Adelaide became aware at some point that they had been working in companionable silence for almost an hour, and that she could not remember the last time she had sat in silence with anyone and found it comfortable rather than awkward. "You should eat something," Rourke said, without looking up from the survey map he was studying. "So should you," Adelaide replied, without looking up from the notary records. There was a pause. "There's a place on 3rd Street called Garvey's that does a decent supper," he said. "If you haven't been." Adelaide set down her pencil and looked at him. He was still looking at the survey map, with the deliberate concentration of a man who was possibly, she thought, slightly nervous, which was an unexpected and rather arresting quality to discover in someone who had faced down 4 armed men that morning without perceptible concern. "I haven't been," she said. He looked up then. His eyes in the lamplight were the color of slate after rain. "Then perhaps we should go." It was not, technically, a supper invitation freighted with romantic implication. It was 2 people who had been working all day and were hungry, making a practical arrangement. Adelaide was aware of this and was also aware that she was constructing this interpretation with a care that itself indicated something. She said, "Give me 5 minutes to put these documents in order." Garvey's was a clean, well-kept establishment run by a broad, energetic woman named Hester Garvey, who produced excellent beef stew and cornbread, and regarded Elijah Rourke with the combination of maternal fondness and mild exasperation that Adelaide suspected he inspired in most people who knew him well. Hester brought them their food and a pot of coffee, and looked at Adelaide with undisguised curiosity before retreating to another table. They ate mostly in comfortable quiet, but the quality of the quiet was different from the office quiet, softer somehow, more aware of itself, "Where is your family?" Adelaide asked at one point. "I have a sister in Missouri," Rourke said. "Helena, she's married with 3 children, we write." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My parents died when I was 17. Fever same year, I was working by then so I managed. Helena was 14. She went to live with an aunt." "I'm sorry," Adelaide said. "It was a long time ago." He said it without deflection, acknowledging the loss without performing it. "Your father built something real," he said after a moment. "I've ridden out to the Townsend parcel. The fencing, the outbuildings, it's clear work. A man who planned to stay." Adelaide felt the specific ache she carried for her father, the grief she had been outrunning with activity since February, settle briefly and unavoidably in her chest. "He was going to have a barn," she said. "He wrote to me about it. He wanted to put up a proper barn and get 2 more horses and maybe some cattle. He kept saying the land could carry it if he managed it right." "It can," Rourke said. She looked at him. "You know farming. I grew up on a farm before everything else, before the law, before Missouri." He paused. "I know land. The Townsend parcel has good grass and 2 reliable water sources. Your father chose well." "He chose what he could afford," Adelaide said. "And then he made it into something good. That's what he always did." She set down her fork and looked at the table for a moment. "I am going to keep it. I want you to know that. Whatever Hatch does, whatever connections he has in Topeka, I am going to keep my father's land and I am going to honor what he built there, and then I am going to build more." She said it without drama, without the tremor that might have been expected after a statement of such complete personal commitment. And when she looked up, Rourke was watching her with an expression that she could not name, but that made her want, very much, to be seen exactly as she was in this moment, without apology or softening. "I believe you," he said. The threat escalated on the 5th day. Adelaide was walking back to the drover's rest from the Marshal's office in the early afternoon, when one of the 4 original men who had followed her from Wichita stepped out of an alley and blocked her path. He was a large man with a flat, deliberate face, and he held nothing in his hands because the threat he was presenting was not the kind that required visible weapons. "Miss Townsend," he said, "Mr. Hatch would appreciate a conversation with you." "Mr. Hatch can request a conversation through his lawyers," Adelaide said. "He has several of them." "Mr. Hatch thought you might respond that way," the man said. "He wanted me to tell you that the legal situation is going to become significantly more complicated before it gets less complicated, and that he's prepared to make the same offer he made to your father 6 months ago, when your father was still alive to hear it. A fair price for a voluntary sale, no complications." Adelaide felt the cold clarity that settled over her in moments when the stakes were most visible. "Tell Mr. Hatch that the last complication he arranged involved a widow's broken arm, and that I am aware of it, and that if anything resembling that kind of complication occurs in relation to my property or my person, I will present my documentation to the Federal Land Commissioner in Washington rather than to a territorial judge, and the Federal Commissioner does not have a history of accepting payments from Meridian." The man's flat face tightened. "Good afternoon," Adelaide said and walked around him. She did not run. She did not walk faster than she had been walking. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady, and she was 3 steps past him when she heard a footfall behind her that was not his, and turned to find Elijah Rourke falling into step beside her, appearing from the direction of the hardware store with the same quiet, unhurried quality he had displayed in the land office, as though he had simply been in the vicinity and found it convenient to walk this direction. "That was well handled," he said low. "You were watching." "I was in the vicinity," he said, dry, almost amused. "You were watching," she said again, a pause. "Yes," he said, "I was watching." They walked together in silence for half a block, and Adelaide was aware of the warmth of his presence at her shoulder, and the way the town arranged itself slightly differently around them when they were together. The way people noted the Marshal's star and drew certain conclusions. And she thought that those conclusions were both practically useful and personally complicated, and that she was going to have to deal with the personal complication eventually, because it was becoming increasingly difficult to file under irrelevant. "He threatened my property," she said, directly, with the implication that the sale offer was an alternative to physical interference. "I heard." The easy manner had gone out of his voice. "I need you to stay close to public areas for the next few days. I've written to my contact at the federal office. I've also asked James to ride to the cross-county courthouse directly, not just to deliver your message but to speak to the judge's clerk personally and impress upon them the urgency. How long before we can expect a hearing date? 2 weeks if the judge moves quickly, possibly 3. "That is a long time to stay close to public areas," Adelaide said. "I know." He looked at her sideways. "I'll also ride out to your property tomorrow. I want to make sure nothing has been disturbed." It's common for Meridian to damage buildings or fencing as a way of creating apparent abandonment, which they then use to argue the claim has been vacated. The thought of her father's fencing and outbuildings being deliberately destroyed produced a fury in Adelaide that she let herself feel for exactly 1 moment before containing it. "I want to come with you," she said. He considered this. "That's not without risk." "I'm aware." She looked at him steadily. "I want to see it." "I've never been to the property. I've been working with documents and descriptions and my father's letters for 4 months, and I haven't actually seen the land. I want to see it." He understood this. She could see that he did. "We leave at dawn," he said. "Bring practical clothes." She had, in fact, packed practical clothes. She had packed them before leaving Cincinnati in the knowledge that she might need to work and not simply litigate, and she was wearing them the next morning when she met Rourke at the livery, a divided riding skirt and a sturdy jacket over a high-necked blouse, her hair pinned tightly under a broad-brimmed hat. Rourke had a bay gelding saddled for her beside his own gray, and he helped her mount with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man to whom this was simply a practical task, though his hand at her elbow was steady and warm, and lasted 1 second longer than strictly necessary. The ride out to the Townsend parcel took 2 hours, along a track that wound northeast through rolling grassland that was, Adelaide realized, extraordinarily beautiful in the early morning light. The prairie spread out golden and enormous on every side, and the sky above it was the kind of blue that only existed at altitude and in early morning, and Adelaide understood for the first time, viscerally and completely, why her father had come here and stayed. "He loved it," she said, almost to herself. "I could tell from his letters, but I didn't understand it until now. He loved this country." Rourke rode beside her, slightly back, giving her the view. "Most people who last out here do," he said. "The ones who don't leave in the first year. Did you love it when you came?" He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized by now that his pauses were not evasions but actual thought, which she respected. "I don't know that love is the right word for what I feel about this country," he said. "It's more that I feel right here, like the scale of it matches something internal. I was always uncomfortable in cities. The smallness of the spaces." Adelaide looked at the horizon, which was approximately the farthest horizon she had ever seen, and thought that this made complete sense for a man who occupied his own space the way Elijah Rourke did, with that total, self-contained certainty. They reached the property and spent 3 hours riding the boundary lines, checking the fencing, examining the outbuildings. Someone had been there. A section of the north fence had been cut and hastily restrung, inexpertly, in a way that someone without a trained eye might have missed. One of the 2 sheds had its lock forced, though nothing inside appeared to have been taken. Adelaide stood in the middle of her father's yard, looking at the house he had built with rough lumber and considerable care, and felt the full weight of what she was fighting for settle into her bones and become permanent. "He built this himself," she said. "He told me in his letters. He hired help for the heavy framing, but the finish work was his." Rourke stood beside her, looking at the house. "It's good work," he said quietly. "I am going to live here," Adelaide said. She had not said this out loud before, not to anyone, and saying it felt like planting something. Like the act of saying it made it more real and more committed and more possible all at once. "When this is resolved, I am going to come here and live in this house and work this land. I know how to manage accounts and I can learn the rest." "You'll learn it," Rourke said, with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact. She looked at him. He was standing in the morning sun in the yard of her father's house, his hat in his hands, squinting slightly at the light, and there was something about the image that her mind fixed on with an intensity she recognized as significant. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "I know what you told me in the office, the honest law answer, but beyond that." He looked at her for a long moment with a directness that did not flinch. "Because you walked into that land office alone and stood at that counter like you had already decided how the story ended, and nobody had told you the right to make that decision didn't belong to you. And because Hatch has been the dark past of this territory for 3 years, and I have been waiting for someone with clean enough hands and strong enough documentation to help me end it." He paused. "And because there was something in your face when you put those documents on that counter that I have not been able to stop thinking about since." The honesty of this landed in the air between them, and neither of them looked away from it. Adelaide said, "That is 3 separate reasons." "They are all true," Rourke said. She turned back to the house because she needed a moment to process what she was feeling, and because the particular combination of hope and uncertainty and wanting that had settled in her chest required a moment of privacy to be examined honestly. She walked up the 2 steps to the porch and tried the door, which opened without a key, because her father had apparently not put a lock on the front door, which told her something about either his nature or his sense of security or both. The inside was dim and smelled of dust and old wood smoke and something faintly herbal, sage perhaps, and it was small and tidy and completely, heartbreakingly her father's, with the same careful order to the few possessions as there had been in his letters. She stood in the middle of it and let herself grieve, briefly, honestly, and when she turned around, Rourke was standing in the doorway with the hat still in his hands, not coming in, waiting. "You don't have to stand in the doorway," she said. He came in. They rode back to Caldwell in the late afternoon, talking more freely than they had before, about smaller things. His sister's children, a book Adelaide had been reading on the federal land system, the question of whether the grass on the northeast section of the parcel was good enough for cattle, and what breed would be sensible to start with. The conversation moved easily, and Adelaide found herself laughing twice, actually laughing at something dry and unexpected that Rourke said, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her with its realness. They were half an hour from town when Rourke pulled his horse up suddenly. "Rider behind us," he said, quietly. "On the east ridge. Watching." Adelaide did not turn to look. One of Hatch's men, possibly, keep the same pace. He moved his horse slightly so that he was more directly between her and the ridge. "I don't want him to know we've spotted him." They rode into Caldwell at the same easy pace, and Rourke saw her to the door of the Drover's Rest with the curtness of a man who was already calculating what came next. "Go inside and stay there tonight," he said. "I'm going to have a conversation with Hatch." Adelaide caught his arm as he turned to go, without thinking, and he stopped and looked down at where her hand was on his sleeve, and then at her face. "Be careful," she said. The thing that crossed his face then was not the careful neutral expression she had come to associate with him in professional contexts. It was something unguarded, something that knew itself to be wanted. And for a moment the 2 of them stood in the street with the lamplight coming on around them, and the whole of the late frontier day settling into evening. And Adelaide felt with complete clarity that she was at a threshold of a very different kind than the one she had walked through in the land office. "I will be," he said, and he turned her hand over where it rested on his sleeve just for a moment, his thumb crossing her palm, and then he let go. She went inside. She did not sleep. The conversation with Hatch was not, apparently, a pleasant one. Rourke came to the Marshal's office in the morning looking exactly as he always did, except for a slight tightening around his eyes that she had learned to read as controlled frustration. He had presented Hatch with a formal notice that any interference with the Townsend property prior to the court hearing would constitute criminal trespass and interference with a legal proceeding, and Hatch had smiled at him with the smile of a man who had enough people in his pocket to make law feel like a minor inconvenience. "He's going to move before the hearing," Rourke said. "I can feel it. He's not a man who waits when he's seen the way things are going." "Then we move first," Adelaide said. "I want to send a second communication to the Federal Land Office in Washington directly, not through the territorial system. Pruitt in Wichita had a contact there, a Mr. Dwight Carmichael who handles patent disputes. I should have gone directly to him from the beginning. Write it today. James can take the telegraph to Ellsworth and send it from there rather than the local office." "Hatch has someone at the Caldwell telegraph." "Of course he does," Adelaide said, with a tired precision that made Rourke look at her with a kind of appreciation that had nothing professional about it. She wrote the telegraph that morning and spent the afternoon with Rourke preparing a full summary of the fraudulent claim documentation to accompany it. A 20-page document that laid out the surveying language anachronism, the incorrect notary seal registration, and 3 other discrepancies they had found in the past week, in language precise enough to withstand federal scrutiny. James Wilder left for Ellsworth at 4 in the afternoon, and Rourke watched him go with the particular expression of a man who was committing a significant piece to a board and knew it. The next 3 days were strange. The open threat seemed to have retreated, but the retreat felt tactical rather than genuine, and the town went about its business with the slightly heightened awareness of a community that sensed something building under the surface. Adelaide went through her days with her documents and her careful preparations, and her daily visits to the Marshal's office that had, by now, become something more than professional habit, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this. She was honest enough with herself on the 4th evening of those strange, quiet days when Rourke walked her back from Garvey's and they paused on the boardwalk outside the Drover's Rest, and the conversation found one of its natural, comfortable silences to say what she was thinking. "I find myself looking forward to the work in the mornings," she said carefully, "and I recognize that is not entirely about the documents." He looked at her with those gray eyes and the lamplight on his face, and said nothing for a moment that felt like it was doing a great deal of work. "Adelaide," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it sounded in his voice like something that had been there for a while, waiting for the right moment. "You are allowed to say it," she said. "I don't want to complicate something you're already managing," he said. "You came here to fight for your land, and you are winning that fight on your own terms. I am aware that I am a variable you didn't plan for." "You are," she agreed. "But I have found, unexpectedly, that unplanned variables are not always unwelcome." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had come loose from her pin back behind her ear, a gesture so careful and unhurried that Adelaide felt it in her sternum, and he looked at her for one long moment and then said, "Good night, Adelaide," and walked back toward the Marshal's office, and she stood on the boardwalk in the cooling evening air and pressed her hand briefly against her own heart and laughed at herself, very quietly, with complete and honest affection for the ridiculous thing that was apparently happening to her in the middle of a property rights dispute. The response from Washington came in 9 days, which was faster than anyone had expected. James Wilder returned from Ellsworth with a telegraph from Dwight Carmichael at the Federal Land Office, informing them that the discrepancies Adelaide had identified in the Meridian competing claim were sufficient to warrant a federal review, and that he was ordering a stay of all land office proceedings on the Townsend parcel, pending the outcome of that review. The stay was federal, which meant it superseded the territorial system entirely, which meant that Hatch's connections in Topeka were suddenly considerably less useful. Rourke read the telegraph twice and then handed it to Adelaide, and she read it twice, and then they looked at each other across the desk in the morning light, and the shared relief of it was so enormous that Adelaide felt briefly unsteady. "He can't process the competing claim," she said. "He cannot," Rourke said. "And any interference with your property at this point constitutes interference with a federal proceeding. That changes the nature of what I can do if he moves against the land." "He'll fight the federal review," Adelaide said. "His connections may not reach Washington, but he'll find other ways to complicate it." "He will," Rourke said, "but he'll be fighting uphill now. And Hatch doesn't prefer uphill." It was in this state of cautious relief that Cornelius Hatch made his move, 3 days later, in the last way Adelaide had expected. He came to see her himself. He appeared at the Drovers' Rest on a Wednesday morning, alone, presenting himself with the smooth, assured manner of a man who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. A heavy-set man in his middle 50s with expensive clothes, and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had not been told no very often, and had decided some time ago that this was the natural order of things. He sat across from Adelaide in the hotel parlor, and he was unfailingly polite and entirely chilling. He told her he admired her tenacity. He told her the Federal Review would take 18 months and cost more in legal fees than the land was worth. He told her that the offer he was making was, by any reasonable accounting, more than fair, and that there was no shame in accepting it, that her father himself had been considering it before his death. This last statement was calculated to wound, and it landed. Adelaide kept her face level. "My father was not considering it. He wrote to me 3 weeks before he died about improvements he was planning to make to the property." A man considering a sale does not plan improvements. "People can hold 2 thoughts simultaneously," Hatch said pleasantly. "What they cannot do," Adelaide said, "is file fraudulent land claims using incorrectly dated survey language and notary seals from reorganized counties without eventually having that fraud identified and placed before a federal examiner, which is where we currently are, Mr. Hatch." The pleasantness remained on his face, but the room changed slightly. "You are a determined young woman," he said. "I am my father's daughter," she said. He left without making another offer, which told her the polite approach had been a final attempt. She sat in the hotel parlor for a few minutes after he was gone, feeling the aftermath of the conversation, and then she went to find Rourke. He was not in his office. She found him at the livery, talking to a rancher from the east side of the county who was reporting that one of his outbuildings had been burned the previous night. Not the Townsend property, a neighboring claim. Adelaide stood back and listened and understood that Hatch was expanding his pressure, demonstrating his reach, making clear to the entire community what the cost of standing on the wrong side of his interests might be. When the rancher left, she told Rourke about the morning meeting. His expression when she described Hatch's suggestion that her father had been considering the sale was not neutral. "He said that to test whether it would shake you," Rourke said. "I know it didn't." "I know it didn't," he said, and he looked at her with something fierce and proud and completely unguarded, and Adelaide thought, there it is. There is the thing that has been building between us since the first morning. Named or not, it was there. "I think he is going to escalate to the property directly," she said. "And I think we need to be ready for that. I've already deputized 2 additional men," Rourke said. "Caldwell is a cattle town, and there are always men at the end of the season who want steady work. Good men. I checked their references personally." "I want to move to the property," Adelaide said. "I know you'll say it's isolated, but it is my property, and if Hatch destroys it while I am sitting safely in town, I will never forgive myself. I want to be there." Rourke looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through the competing arguments, the safety case against the practicality case against what he understood about her and what she would and would not accept. "I'll come with you," he said. "I'll bring one of the new deputies, Cooper, and we'll set a rotation." "I'm not leaving you out there alone." "I didn't ask you to leave me alone," Adelaide said. They moved to the property the following morning, the 3 of them, with supplies for a week and Adelaide's documents safely sealed in her satchel. The house had room enough for separate accommodations, and Adelaide noted, with an appreciation that was not uncomplicated, that Rourke arranged things with complete decorum, taking the shed behind the house for himself and Cooper, and leaving the house entirely to Adelaide. The first 2 days at the property were quiet, which was its own kind of tension. the silence of a space being watched and assessed. Adelaide worked the house while Rourke and Cooper rode the fence lines, and she found, to her genuine surprise, that the work of cleaning and airing and organizing the small property was deeply satisfying in a way that teaching school had never quite been. She was working her father's home. She was making it hers. On the second evening she made supper for the three of them, a simple meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread, and they ate at her father's rough table, and Cooper, who was 25 and earnest and visibly uncertain how to behave in the presence of a woman who was simultaneously his principal's client and apparently something rather more than that, talked about his family in Nebraska and the horse he was saving to buy. And Adelaide asked him questions, and Rourke ate his food and watched the two of them with the quiet contentment of a man in a place he had not expected to feel at home in, but did. After Cooper excused himself to take the first watch, Adelaide and Rourke sat on the porch in the cooling night air, and the stars above the Kansas plains were so numerous and so bright that Adelaide, who had spent her adult life in cities, found herself simply staring upward with something close to shock. "I didn't know they looked like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like they're actually there. In Cincinnati you can see stars, but they always look like they're behind something, a gauze curtain. Out here they look actual." Rourke leaned back in his chair and looked up. "It's the air," he said, "nothing to filter it." They were quiet for a while, the comfortable quiet of people who had learned each other well enough that silence did not need filling. "What did you want?" Adelaide asked. "Before this, before Caldwell and the law, what did you plan for yourself?" He thought about it. "When I was young I wanted a farm," he said. "Not a small one, room to grow, cattle maybe, land that was worth working." He paused. "Life took me a different direction." "It can take you back," Adelaide said, and she said it lightly, but she felt the weight of what was underneath it, and she thought he did too. He looked at her in the dark, his face partly lit by the lamp showing through the window behind her. "Adelaide." "You say my name like a question sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it is one," he said. She turned in her chair to face him properly. "What are you asking?" "Whether what I think is happening between us is happening," he said, with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything. "Whether it is only the situation, the common enemy and the common purpose. Those things produce a closeness that sometimes resembles something else." "I thought about that," Adelaide said. "I thought about it the first week when I was still trying to decide whether you were trustworthy, and I thought about it the second week when I had decided you were and was adjusting to what that meant, and I thought about it on the ride out to this property." She looked at him steadily. "It is not only the situation. It would be convenient if it were only the situation. It is not." The space between their chairs was approximately 3 feet, and neither of them moved to close it. And yet the distance felt negligible in the way that distance feels negligible when two people are paying very close attention to each other. "There is something I need to tell you," Rourke said. "Something from before Caldwell." "Tell me," she said. "I was engaged," he said. "In Missouri, a woman named Catherine Wells. We were together 3 years. She left the week before the wedding. She found the work incompatible with the life she wanted, and she was right to be honest about it, but it made me cautious afterward about what I was able to offer someone. A marshal's life is not settled. The danger is real. The uncertainty is constant." Adelaide listened to all of this without interrupting. "I told you this," he said, "because you deserve the complete information, and because I am aware that I have been sitting on this porch wanting very much to say things I should probably say clearly rather than implying them over coffee and survey maps for 2 weeks." "Say them clearly," Adelaide said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been since approximately the second morning you walked into my office with your documents and sat down in that chair like you had been solving problems in it for years. I recognize this is fast, and I recognize the situation is complicated, and I am not asking you to answer that or to feel obligated by it. I am simply telling you because you asked me to be direct." The night was very quiet around them, and the stars were burning, and Adelaide Townsend, who had organized her heart like a set of documents and kept it in careful order for 6 years, felt every single file folder of that arrangement come open simultaneously. "I am also in love with you," she said, with the same simplicity. "I have been resisting it since the day on the boardwalk when you appeared beside me on the way back from the land office, and I realized that the most natural thing in the world was to have you there. I am not resistant anymore." He crossed the 3 feet between the chairs and took her face in both his hands with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and he kissed her in the dark on her father's porch with the Kansas stars overhead and the prairie spread enormous around them. And Adelaide thought that her father, who had loved this land and this sky with his whole practical heart, would have understood exactly what was happening and approved of all of it. They were still on the porch, talking softly, an hour later when Cooper's whistle cut the air from the north fence line. They were both on their feet before the second whistle. Cooper came at a run from the north field, breathing hard. "3 riders coming in from the east ridge. They've got torches." Rourke had his rifle from inside the house in 30 seconds. Adelaide had her father's shotgun, which she had located and cleaned on her second day at the property, and she was loading it when Rourke came back out. He looked at the shotgun and then at her face and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. They positioned themselves. Rourke at the corner of the house with a clear sight line to the approach, Cooper at the barn, Adelaide covering the door of the house, and the approach from the south in case. The 3 riders were a distraction, and the real move came from another direction. The riders came in fast from the east and pulled up when they saw the lamp and the positioning, and one of them called out in a voice Adelaide recognized as belonging to the large, flat-faced man from the alley. "Last chance, Miss Townsend. Mr. Hatch is a patient man, but patience has limits." "Tell Mr. Hatch," Rourke called back, in the clear carrying voice he used when he wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings, "that interfering with a federal land proceeding is a federal crime that will be prosecuted in a federal court where his territorial connections have no reach whatsoever. And tell him that if any one of you takes another step toward this property, I will have all 3 of you in irons before sunrise." There was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. "Tell him yourself," the flat-faced man said, but none of them moved forward. Rourke said nothing. He waited. The 3 men sat on their horses for another full minute. One of them said something to the others, low and inaudible. Then they turned and rode back into the dark. Cooper exhaled audibly from the direction of the barn. Adelaide breathed out and lowered the shotgun and found that her hands were steady, which surprised her somewhat. Rourke came to her. He looked at her hands and her face. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. They kept watch in rotation for the rest of the night, but the riders did not come back. In the morning, Rourke rode to Caldwell to send telegraphs to the federal land office reporting the attempted interference, and Adelaide wrote a detailed account of the previous night's events for the court record, documenting every detail she could recall with the precise language she had learned over 4 months of fighting for this land. The federal review hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later in Topeka, before a federal examiner named Horace Tillman. Rourke accompanied Adelaide to Topeka, making arrangements for Cooper and the second deputy to watch the property while they were gone. The hearing lasted 2 days. Adelaide presented her documentation with the composure and precision of someone who had spent 4 months becoming, out of necessity, an expert in exactly this subject. She presented the survey language anachronism, the notary seal discrepancy, and 7 additional pieces of evidence of fraudulent documentation that she and Rourke had assembled. Rourke testified regarding the 3 attempted incidents of property interference, the arson at the neighboring claim, and the documented pattern of Meridian's activities in Caldwell County over the preceding 3 years. Meridian's lawyers were good, which Adelaide had expected, and they were polished and they had a great deal of paper, but their paper had problems in it that Adelaide had already identified and categorized. And when Examiner Tillman began asking questions, it became clear very quickly that the foundation of their competing claim was as fraudulent as Adelaide had argued it to be. The examiner's finding came on the afternoon of the second day. The Meridian competing claim on the Townsend parcel was found to be fraudulent and was struck from the record. The Townsend inheritance was confirmed valid. Adelaide's transfer of the original patent into her own name was ordered to proceed without impediment. Adelaide sat in the federal hearing room after the examiner left and held her documents and breath, and Rourke sat beside her and said nothing, because he understood that this was a moment that had been purchased at enormous cost and deserved to be felt properly. After a moment she said, "I'm going to go home." He looked at her with everything he felt visible in his face. "Yes," he said. "And so are you," she said, "if you want to." He took her hand in the quiet of the hearing room, deliberately, permanently. "There is nowhere else," he said. The examiner's finding also triggered the investigation into the territorial commissioner's relationship with Meridian, which Rourke had been building toward for 3 years. The federal examiner, having seen Rourke's documentation, forwarded it to the appropriate federal authorities, and the commissioner's position became significantly untenable within the month. He resigned in October of that year, which was a resolution that was not dramatic and not particularly satisfying in the visceral sense, but which was the correct and legal outcome, and Adelaide, who believed in correct and legal outcomes, was satisfied with it. Cornelius Hatch himself faced federal fraud charges that moved through the system with the deliberate patience of federal justice, and eventually resulted in the dissolution of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company's operations in Caldwell County and a substantial fine, which was less than he deserved but more than he had expected, and which stripped him of the comfortable legal cover he had operated under for a decade. Adelaide and Elijah Rourke were married in November of 1882 in a quiet ceremony at the church in Caldwell, attended by Hester Garvey and James Wilder and Cooper, and the neighboring rancher whose building had been burned, and to Adelaide's deep happiness, Rourke's sister Helena, who traveled from Missouri with her husband and her 3 children, and who embraced Adelaide immediately upon meeting her with the warmth of someone who had been waiting a long time for her brother to find the person who matched him. Helena was tall like her brother, and had the same gray eyes and the same quality of direct, honest attention, and Adelaide liked her without qualification. "He wrote to me about you," Helena said on the evening before the wedding when they were sitting together in Hester Garvey's parlor. "He wrote 3 letters before he admitted that was what they were about." "What did he say?" Adelaide asked. Helena smiled. "He said there was a woman who walked into a room and rearranged the air in it. He said he didn't know what to do with that." She looked at Adelaide with something warm and knowing. "I told him to stop overthinking it." "Good advice," Adelaide said. "It is usually the only advice required," Helena said. The wedding was simple and real, and Adelaide wore a dress she had ordered from Wichita in a deep blue wool that Rourke looked at when she came down the church aisle, with an expression that was not at all the controlled, neutral expression she had first known, but was instead completely unguarded and entirely his, and entirely for her. They went home to the Townsend property, which was Adelaide's property, and which Rourke had taken no formal stake in because he was not that kind of man, and she had not asked him to be. They went home to the land her father had built, and to the house her father had made careful, and to the sky that went on forever above the prairie. And Adelaide stood on the porch that evening, the same porch where she had told him she was not resistant anymore, and felt that her father was present somewhere in the solid, particular rightness of all of it. Rourke resigned his Marshal's post the following spring, at the end of his term, recommending James Wilder for the position, which the town accepted. He had been Marshal for 3 years and had done the work honestly, and he was ready, he told Adelaide, to build something instead of protecting it. He learned farming again from the roots up, the way a man relearned something he knew in his bones as a child and had forgotten through long absence. He was good at it. He had always been good at reading land and understanding it, and the Townsend parcel, which was now the Rourke property in the deed books, though Adelaide thought of it always as both their father's and theirs, rewarded the combination of her meticulous record-keeping and planning with his physical knowledge of what land needed and when. They put up the barn her father had planned. It took most of a summer and the help of 4 neighbors who worked 3 days each in exchange for corresponding help with their own projects, which was the economy of community that Adelaide had not known before and found herself moved by. On the last day of the barn's construction, she stood at the edge of the yard and watched the final boards go up and cried without embarrassment, because her father had planned this barn, and she was seeing it completed, and that was a thing worth the tears. Rourke found her there and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him and cried properly. And he did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and they stood together watching the barn in the late afternoon light while the neighbors called to each other, and the sound of hammers rang out, and the sky above them was the kind of blue that only existed in that particular country. They got cattle in the spring of 1883, a modest beginning, 20 head of decent Texas stock that Rourke selected himself, and that Adelaide negotiated the price on, which produced a lively discussion with the seller that Rourke observed from a slight distance with an expression of transparent admiration. Martha Gale, the widow whose arm and collarbone Hatch's men had broken, came to visit in the summer of 1883, having heard through the county's particular communication network that the Townsend property had a new family in it. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s who drove her own buggy and had opinions about everything, and who sat in Adelaide's kitchen drinking coffee and assessed the situation with the rapid accuracy of someone who had learned to read people very precisely as a survival skill. "Your father was a good man," she told Adelaide. "He helped me twice when my well went bad the first winter he was here. Never asked for anything back." "That sounds like him," Adelaide said. "You've got his eyes," Martha said, "and the same way of sitting like you've already decided something but you're waiting to see if anyone else catches up." Adelaide laughed. Martha Gale became a regular visitor that year and then the following year, and Adelaide found in her a kind of friendship she had not anticipated and had not known she was missing, the friendship of an older woman who had lived hard things and come through them intact, and who respected Adelaide's particular combination of formality and iron without requiring any adjustment to it. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was difficult. Kansas winters were not gentle, and Adelaide learned this fully that year. The particular bone-deep cold and the isolation, and the way the landscape became both magnificent and completely unforgiving under snow and ice. They lost 2 cattle to the cold, and the fence on the east side went down in a storm in February and had to be rebuilt in conditions that were brutal. But there was also the particular intimacy of a difficult winter shared, the evenings by the fire with books and the low, comfortable exchange of a household that had settled into itself, and Adelaide thought often during that winter that she had not known what warmth meant, actual sustained ordinary warmth, until she had built a life that produced it. Their son was born in July of 1884. Adelaide had spent the pregnancy with her characteristic practical preparation, corresponding with a doctor in Caldwell and reading everything she could find on the subject. And when the time came, Hester Garvey came out from town as planned, and the doctor came, and the birth was hard in the way births are hard but without catastrophe. And Adelaide came through it with the same determination she brought to everything. Elijah Rourke held his son for the first time in the afternoon light of their bedroom, standing very still with the small, solid weight in his arms, and he looked at Adelaide on the bed, and the expression on his face was the most open thing she had ever seen, something so unguarded and enormous that she felt her own chest expand with it. "Gerald," she said. "I'd like to call him Gerald." Rourke looked at the baby and then at Adelaide. "Gerald," he said, and it was the softest she had ever heard his voice. Gerald Rourke grew up on the land that his maternal grandfather had built, under Kansas skies that were enormous and indifferent and beautiful, with a mother who taught him to read and to keep records and to argue a position logically, and a father who taught him to read land and weather and the character of horses. And the combination produced a boy who was curious and careful and had gray eyes and an annoying tendency to pause before answering any question, as if he were actually thinking about it, which Adelaide recognized immediately as his father's habit and loved accordingly. James Wilder, who was doing an excellent job as Marshal of Caldwell, married a woman named Frances Porter in the spring of 1885, and Adelaide and Rourke were at the wedding, and Adelaide danced with Rourke in the town hall while little Gerald, aged almost a year, was handed around by Helena's children who had come again from Missouri for the occasion. Helena visited every summer, a tradition that had established itself by the second year, and that Adelaide found she arranged her calendar around with a pleasure that was entirely genuine. Helena's children adopted Adelaide with the particular enthusiastic totality of children who had been told by their mother that this woman was wonderful, and who found upon arrival that the information was accurate. Adelaide wrote to Aldous Pruitt in Wichita in the fall of 1885, a long overdue accounting of everything that had occurred since she had left his office with her documents and her determination. Pruitt wrote back to say that he was delighted and that he had never doubted the outcome, which Adelaide knew to be a revision of his actual position, but appreciated anyway. The second child came in the spring of 1886, a daughter this time, whom they named Catherine after no one in particular, simply because they both loved the name, and it fit the small particular person who arrived with dark hair and Adelaide's brown eyes, and an immediate vocal confidence that suggested she had inherited from both sides of her family the tendency to say what she thought. The land was good that year. The cattle had grown to 60 head, and there was talk of adding more the following spring. The barn stood solid and weathered, and the house had been extended by 2 rooms that Rourke and 3 neighboring men had added the previous summer, making space for a proper study where Adelaide kept her books and her records, and where she sometimes spent winter evenings reading while Rourke sat in the armchair he had acquired from a traveling goods merchant, and which was worn now and entirely his. Adelaide Townsend, who was now Adelaide Rourke by name and by every practical and emotional definition, sometimes thought about the woman who had walked into the Caldwell land office in the summer of 1882, alone, with her documents pressed flat against the pine counter, and her hands forced steady, fighting for something she had never seen and had not known she needed until she stood in the middle of it. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't known yet, about the land and the sky and the way honest law felt when it was practiced by someone who believed in it completely, about barns and cattle and candlelight in a kitchen, and the sound of children moving through a house that had been built by someone who had loved this country with his whole heart, and about the fact that a person could walk into the right moment without knowing it was the right moment, and find their entire life altered in the absolute best possible way by the quiet appearance at their elbow of someone who simply intended to stand beside them. The winter of 1886 was milder than the previous 2, and on a February afternoon when the light was low and golden, and the snow had thinned to a crisp layer across the yard, and the cattle were visible and placid in the pasture, Adelaide stood on the porch with her coffee cup and listened to Gerald talking to himself in the interior of the house, a complex running commentary on something only he could see, and the sound of Rourke coming up the path from the barn, and the quiet particular music of an ordinary afternoon on her father's land. She was 33 years old and she was home. Rourke came up the steps and stopped beside her and looked out at the pasture, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her with the ease of complete familiarity, and they stood together in the pale winter light with the sky enormous above the Kansas plain, and the silence of it big enough to hold everything they had made. "I have been thinking," Adelaide said. "I know," Rourke said. He said it with the dry, gentle humor that lived underneath his seriousness, and that she found inexhaustible. "You have a particular look when you have been thinking. Do I? You do. You've had it since the second morning in my office. He looked down at her. What have you been thinking about? Spring, she said. The eastern section of the parcel. Father wrote once about planting fruit trees. He thought it had the right drainage. I've been looking at the survey and I think he was right. Rourke was quiet for a moment in the thinking way. Apple or cherry, he said. Both, Adelaide said. He nodded slowly, looking at the eastern section of the property across the winter field. We'll need to order the stock in February to get it by planting time. I know. I've already written to a nursery in Lawrence. She turned to look at him. You are not surprised. I am never surprised by you, he said. And it was said with such genuine affection and such complete honesty that Adelaide felt it exactly as her father had described the land. As something that could carry more than you expected, if you managed it right. She turned back to the view, her coffee warm in her hands, the children's voices moving through the house behind her, the land stretching out under the winter sky in every direction, all of it hers, all of it theirs, all of it built on the foundation of a man who had come west with nothing but determination and a belief that something good could be made from hard work and honest dealing. And on the continuation of that work by a daughter who had walked into a land office alone one summer morning and found standing beside her, as quiet and certain as the country itself, exactly the person she had not known she was looking for. The fruit trees went in that spring in the eastern section, where the drainage was exactly right. The apple trees bloomed their second year, and Gerald Rourke, aged almost 3, stood in the pale pink and white of the blossoms with his arms out, and turned in a slow circle with his face upward the way children do with snowflakes. And Adelaide watched him from the end of the row with a happiness that was simply and completely real. The way the stars were real out here, not behind glass, not filtered or diminished, actual and present and burning with their own clear light. Elijah Rourke came up beside her and took her hand, and they watched their son spin in the apple blossoms, and Catherine sat in the crook of Rourke's other arm and regarded the blossoms with the thoughtful assessment of a child already forming opinions, and the land that Adelaide Townsend had built with his hands and his hope held them all in the spring morning, and Adelaide thought, this is it. This is all of it. This is the whole story, and it is exactly right. She had walked into the land office alone. She had not walked out that way, and everything that followed, all of it, had been the fullest and finest kind of consequence.